The Salem witch trials, a village's descent into madness. Imagine living in a tight-knit community where just one bizarre rumor could literally erase your existence. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most terrifying and, honestly, most misunderstood chapters in early American history. We're skipping the dry court docs and the Hollywood myths today. Instead, we're going to step right into the freezing, paranoid shoes of the everyday townspeople who actually lived through it. We want to figure out, how does an entire community completely lose its grip on reality? Okay, let's dive into this. What would it take for you to accuse your own neighbor of witchcraft? Seriously, picture yourself in the muddy, freezing streets of 1692 Salem. What would it actually take for you to point a finger at the person living right next door to you, knowing for a fact that your accusation could send them straight to the gallows? To understand how ordinary farmers reach that breaking point, we have to recognize that this wasn't just some sudden burst of evil. It was a slow-building pressure cooker of absolute dread. The foundation of that dread really comes down to a tale of two Salems. You've got Salem town, which is affluent, full of merchants, worldly. And then you have Salem village, struggling, agrarian, isolated, and fearful. Salem village, which is present-day Danvers, was pretty much entirely miserable. These people had just survived a massive smallpox epidemic, they lived in constant terror of raids from neighboring Native American tribes, and they endured brutally harsh winters. So you have this bitter socioeconomic tension between the wealthy town and the starving village, and it served as the ultimate powder keg. Step 1, Betty and Abigail suffer violent fits. Step 2, Dr. Griggs diagnoses bewitchment. And Step 3, 3 outcast women are accused. So here's the spark. In January 1692, the 9-year-old daughter and 11-year-old niece of the local minister Samuel Parris started having these terrifying fits. We're talking screaming, throwing things, contorting their bodies into bizarre, unnatural positions. A local doctor, William Griggs, couldn't find a medical cause, so he went with the only diagnosis that made sense to a 17th century Puritan mind: bewitchment. Under intense pressure from the adults, the girls started pointing fingers. And they didn't point at the powerful. They pointed at 3 highly vulnerable outcast women: Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; Sarah Osborne, an impoverished elderly woman; and Tituba, an enslaved woman living in the Parris household. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer volume of modern theories for the fits. We've got ergot poisoning, which is a fungus on rye; conversion disorder; epilepsy; socioeconomic hardships; and factionalism. Today, we have a massive arsenal of scientific and sociological explanations for what those girls were actually experiencing. We can look back and point to something like ergot poisoning, which causes intense hallucinations and muscle spasms. Or maybe it was conversion disorder brought on by extreme stress, compounded by all that factionalism and hardship we just talked about. But in 1692, none of this existed for them. They had a singular, absolute belief that the devil was a physical, literal presence actively trying to destroy their Christian community. Tituba's shocking confession of a satanic pact triggered mass panic and silenced any skepticism that the devil had infiltrated Salem. You see, that fear was totally validated in the courtroom. During the initial examinations, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne flat out denied the charges. But Tituba, likely realizing that as an enslaved woman she had zero legal protection and was facing certain conviction, made a strategic choice. She confessed. And she didn't just confess, she wove these vivid, terrifying tales of being approached by Satan. She claimed there was a whole coven of witches operating right there in Salem doing his bidding. Her confession was the trigger. It inadvertently validated the villagers' absolute worst nightmares and completely shut down anyone who might have thought the girls were just faking it. Spectral evidence. Legal testimony based on dreams and visions where an accused person's spirit or specter torments the victim. To handle this growing panic, the governor set up a special court of oyer and terminer, and this court relied heavily on this concept of spectral evidence. Guys, this is exactly as absurd as it sounds. It's legal testimony based entirely on dreams and visions. An accuser could literally stand up in court and say, "I see the invisible spirit of my neighbor choking me right now." I mean, how do you defend against an invisible, unprovable crime? You can't. This deeply flawed loophole effectively removed the presumption of innocence. It allowed the court to legally execute people based on a teenager's nightmare. The hysteria quickly became a weapon for powerful families, like the Putnams, to settle petty land grabs and exact revenge on neighbors. Once spectral evidence was on the table, the trials mutated. It wasn't just about religious panic anymore. It became a deadly tool for personal gain. If you look at it from the perspective of an everyday townsperson, the terror wasn't just the devil anymore. It was the people living around you. Powerful, deeply entrenched families like the Putnams realized they could use this hysteria to settle old scores. Think about it. If you had a property line dispute with a neighbor or a bitter rivalry over church politics, suddenly calling them a witch was a highly effective, albeit horrific, way to get them completely out of the picture. We really have to humanize this history to grasp it. Let's look at Bridget Bishop, the first person convicted and hanged on June 10, 1692, versus Giles Corey, an elderly man pressed to death under heavy stones for remaining silent. Bridget Bishop was an older, fiercely independent woman known around town for being a bit quarrelsome. That made her an easy target, and she became the very first person sent to Gallows Hill. Then you have Giles Corey. When this elderly farmer was accused, he flat out refused to legitimize this corrupt court by entering a plea. So the sheriff literally crushed him to death under heavy stones to try and force a plea out of him. These weren't just caricatures in the storybook. These were real neighbors suffering horrific cruelty, all masked as Puritan justice. Myth fact check. No accused witches were ever burned at the stake in Salem. Under English law, they were hanged. Time for a quick reality check here. Thanks to pop culture, whenever we hear the phrase witch trial, we instantly picture stakes and blazing fires. But no accused witches were ever burned at the stake in Salem. The Massachusetts Bay Colony operated under English law, which meant witchcraft was a felony punishable by hanging. Burning was actually reserved for very specific crimes like high treason. So the grim reality of Salem was the rope, not the fire. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. January 1692, the first fits are reported. June 1692, the first hanging takes place. September 1692, public opinion begins to turn. And by October 1692, the special court is dissolved. What is absolutely terrifying here is how incredibly fast this madness escalated. The very first symptoms happened in January. By June, Bridget Bishop is swinging from a tree. The hangings accelerated violently through the summer, until September, when the sheer volume of accusations finally started targeting highly respected, pious community members. That's the moment public opinion suddenly snapped awake. By October, the governor realized the justice system had completely failed, and that special court was gone. The core of this deadly hysteria lasted less than a single year. Local farmer John Proctor scoffed at the trials, calling the girls scam artists. As a result, his entire family was accused and he was executed. Now you might be wondering, why didn't more people just stand up and point out how crazy this all was? Well, skepticism in 1692 was basically a death sentence. Take John Proctor. He openly scoffed at the trials. He called the afflicted girls scam artists and demanded the proceedings be moved to Boston for fairness. The court's response to this? They accused him of being a witch. Then they accused his pregnant wife. Then his children. Anyone who questioned the hysteria or dared to defend an accused neighbor was instantly targeted by the mob themselves. Proctor was hanged in August. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. That's a quote from Increase Mather. Reason did eventually pierce the paranoia, thank goodness. Prominent Harvard-connected ministers finally started to push back against the absolute absurdity of spectral evidence. Increase Mather, who was a highly influential Boston minister, drew a hard line in the sand with that quote. By demanding that the legal standards for witchcraft be just as rigorous as any other capital crime, leaders like Mather finally broke the fever and shut down the executions. 200. So the crucial point is the scale of this. When the dust finally settled, more than 200 people had been formally accused. In the context of a tiny 17th century colonial village, that is a staggering percentage of the population. Just imagine walking down your street knowing dozens of your neighbors have been dragged out of their homes, stripped of everything, and thrown into cramped, freezing, dirt floor dungeons. They were literally chained to the walls to prevent their invisible spirits from escaping. It's just wild to think about. 25. The ultimate human toll of that panic is incredibly heavy. 25 innocent people lost their lives to this madness. 19 everyday men and women were hanged on Gallows Hill. One elderly man was crushed to death, and 5 more perished just waiting in the brutal, unsanitary conditions of the colonial jails. 25 lives erased, simply because a community let fear completely override their humanity. Looking at the aftermath timeline, 1697 brings a day of fasting and apologies. 1711, good names are restored with £600 in restitution. 1957, the state formally apologizes, and in 2022, the final victim is exonerated. Salem suffered a very long hangover. The guilt set in almost immediately. By 1697, judges like Samuel Sewall were publicly apologizing, and the state ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching. In 1711, the colony tried to make amends by restoring the good names of many victims and paying restitution to their ruined families. But, the bureaucratic wheels of justice turned painfully slow. It wasn't until 1957 that Massachusetts formally apologized. And incredibly, it wasn't until the year 2022 that the very last victim, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., was officially exonerated. And that was all thanks to the persistent lobbying of a middle school civics class. If hysteria could so easily weaponize the justice system against innocent neighbors in 1692, what unseen fears are dividing our own communities today? The legacy of Salem is far more than just a spooky Halloween story, right? It's a stark historical warning about the fragility of reason. When we see how easily an entire justice system was weaponized against innocent neighbors due to unchecked fear, isolation, and factionalism, we have to ask ourselves a hard question. What unseen fears are dividing our own communities today? And who are the outcasts we're just a little too quick to blame when things go wrong?